Hello and welcome to the show. Do me a favor, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Always greatly appreciated whenever you tune in, especially during a tough season, another tough season like this one. In a couple minutes, I'll be joined by ESPN Seth Wickersham as we talk about the big story about Dan Snyder on ESPN.com earlier this week. Seth and I, of course, work for ESPN.com. Seth wrote and reported the story with Don Van Natta Jr. and Tisha Thompson, and they did an exhaustive work on this. So I talked to Seth about the story tries to answer two questions. I think it did, and we're going to get into that. How is Dan Snyder still in charge despite all the issues going on and all the problems in Washington? And what are the avenues that other owners could go down if indeed they want to remove him or try and force him to sell? We get into all that. Just know one of the best reporters in this business in terms of ties with the ownership, it's Seth. So you need to pay attention to what he says because that guy knows. And the reporting was exhaustive. And I will go through the process of what it takes to write a piece like that, ESPN. Of course, I know how deeply vetted things must be there because I've had to experience it. So I know there's an exhaustive process. It's not as simple as, hey, we talked to this guy and boom, there's a story. No, there's a lot of conversations that take place. Anyway, there you go. So in a minute, I'll get to him, but I want to get to a couple things first, starting with Carson Wentz, who broke a finger in Thursday's 12-7 win over the Bears. We don't know yet how much time he will miss. He is going to visit a hand specialist on Monday in Los Angeles. That will determine how much time he missed, if he'll need surgery. So really, it's hard to speculate what's going to happen. Listen, when Russell Wilson fractured a finger last year, the initial reports were 6 weeks. That's about where you would get to with the fractured finger, is up to 6 weeks. But I don't know what the deal is in this case because he's got to see the hand specialist. Is it possible that, again, what if he needs surgery? What if he doesn't? What if the guy says, oh, it's at a certain level, you can play in a week, 2 weeks, maybe you have to. We don't know how much time he's going to miss. And I would say, if any, now chances are you're going to see a hand specialist, you're probably going to miss some time, but we don't know that for sure. So let's wait and see. If he indeed does have to miss time, and depending on how long it is, Taylor Heinicke would be the guy that they want to go and try and give a spark to this team. And one of the things I talked about after the game, I wrote a little bit about it just in some of our takeaways, was Wentz's mobility or immobility to me limits this offense. And right now, I think they need somebody who can create something with their legs, in part because they're not getting the protection. And I think they need to diversify a little bit. And one of the things you loved about Wentz that for when they got him is, the ability to use the entire field. Well, if you're not being protected, you don't have that ability. Because, we've seen some big time throws from him. It's not that he can't make it. It's that they're not, this is a stagnant offense. So, and I'm not saying that Heinicke's better. I just wonder in that regard, could it help this offense at all? It does. It's, his arm's going to limit them in some ways because it has in the past, but the ability to make plays, maybe that creates some sort of a different spark. And the other thing is, and it's not just all on Wentz here. That protection has been bad, but I also think it's up to the coaches to give him more answers when he's at the line of scrimmage in certain situations, like a blitz. They do not handle those pressures well. And I'll go back to the first pressure that Chicago had in the sack on a third down. I think it was an all-out, basically cover zero, but there were 3 receivers in the route, and there were 3 defensive backs, obviously one-on-one, but they were all about 10 yards or so off the line of scrimmage. The middle of the field is vacated. If you're under heavy pressure, the receivers can see their guy is blitzing off the edge. It was Samuel and McLaurin in a stack to the right. Yet nobody goes to the middle of the field. The middle of the field is wide open. Why does nobody go to the middle of the field? Why is there not the ability to adjust to a hot route or whatever if you see that situation? That to me is just bad. It's just bad. And you watch that play, it's like, I don't get it. Not one receiver. There are 3 on the route. Again, not one was turned around when Wentz was sacked. Why is that? It doesn't make sense to me. If you know the guy's going, you need to give somebody the ability to break to the middle of the field, right? So my goal this week is to find out from a couple people, why doesn't that happen? Is it a function of newness to the offense for Wentz? Is it just a function of philosophy, which I think part of that is. If so, why? It doesn't make sense. There are some other routes in the game where I'm like, this doesn't make sense either. Why you continue on this route when you see this type of situation? And sometimes that's just the way it goes. But in this case, wide open. if you give someone the ability to get to there and it's an easy first down. It doesn't make sense to me. So I'm going to try and find some answers for you and for me. I want to know. Anyway, there you go with Wentz. And then again, I'll get real quick into why somebody's going to, I know people have asked, why I want to see Sam Howell. Well, the coaches see Sam Howell every day. Don't forget, they're in meetings, they're in the practices. They know what he knows. They know what he's capable of doing. They want to win. So you got to play the best guy who's going to give you the chance to win right now, and that's Taylor Heinicke. It's not Sam Howell. Heinicke obviously more experienced. Does Howell have a better arm? Yeah, probably. But it's not just about the arm strength, folks. It's about knowledge of defenses, et cetera. But the bottom line is, maybe you want to see Howell, but they want to win, and that's why they're going to go to Heinicke. That's why they would go to Heinicke to try and get them. This is a coaching staff that needs to win, folks. The only way you can see, they need to win. And if Howell goes in there and tears it up and lights it up, all right, you buy yourself time. If they don't think that's going to happen, they're not putting him in. All right. So there you go. If we get to that point, then the season's probably lost. If the season's lost, then we could be looking at new staff in here next year and a top 10 quarterback pick, regardless of what Sam Howell does this year. Anyway, I have a feeling you may get to see him at some point this year because the way seasons go here, that's usually what happens. But for now, if it's not Wentz, then Heinicke would go in there, and because again, this team needs to win, and you may think they're not in the playoff chase, but mathematically they are, and so they're going to play that way. And so they've only played 6 games. You're not going to punt on the season after 6 games if you think there's an ability, and maybe this guy gives you a spark. We'll see. Don't know. We'll go on. We'll see what happens on Monday. That's all I can tell you. Last one or 2 more. Chase Young. He's going to go see Dr. Andrews to see how long, to see, if he's close to coming back or where he's at in his recovery, if he can come back. I don't know when he's going to see him, but it's going to be very soon. It may have already happened. It may be early this coming week. But bottom line is he'll go see him, and then the next steps will be determined from there. And finally, William Jackson III, as you know, would like to be traded. There's been no formal request for a trade. I just think it's becoming obvious. The only problem here is he's a guy who's a man corner, wants to play more man coverage. That's fine. No team plays 100% man. That means you're going to have to play zone and probably around 60% of the time. That's a lot. That's going to make it tough to trade him because he has shown that he struggles in zone. He showed that in Cincinnati. And so what would a team be willing to give up for a guy who would have to learn your defense? And he struggled in this zone. He's going to have to learn your defense. And, what are you willing to give up for him? And I asked one executive, and he thought at best it'd be like a late round pick at best. So I don't know, I think it'd be good for him. It'd be good for them to get something. But I don't know what's going to happen. I just know there's been no official request for a trade. I don't think his value is very high. I do think if you go play, if he could play more man, great. But he struggled in that times here. He struggled at times here. And so, I think it's going to be tough for him to command a lot of value. But we'll see. Maybe somebody gives something because corners are still hard to come by. One thing I would always say, knowing when they signed him, I heard that zone would be a problem for him. So it makes me wonder, why do you pair him with Kendall Fuller? They're different types of corners. I know you're trying to diversify your defense a little bit, but it just seems like that was a tough pairing. So anyway, there you go. Now, here's my conversation with ESPN's Seth Wickersham. Well, Seth, first of all, tremendous job. And so, but I wanted to give readers or listeners a sense of what is that you and Don and Tisha went through to get the information you did in the story about Dan Snyder and the investigators, et cetera, and the other owners. First of all, how many people did you guys talk to approximately?
Well, it was well north than 30. I don't know the exact number. We didn't do a count, but we did add it up at one point, and it was more. It was around 30, and then we added some on top of that, but we didn't end up. I think we just put more than 30 in there. I'm not exactly sure what the number was, but it was between 30 and 40.
And the filters to get the information from what you, because you guys are going to hear a lot, and I know this, you guys hear a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't get in there. How do you decide what gets in there, and what are the filters it must go through to go from, hey, I heard this, to I can report this?
Yeah, I would say this. We are so lucky, and I'm not just saying this because we're ESPN employees, but
right.
The jobs that we have are so lucky that we are under no pressure to deliver a story by a certain time. and even really to deliver a story. Like our editors are, the trust is there to send us out to go try to report stories, knowing that maybe they don't work out. That's the way it works sometimes with some of these harder stories. Sometimes, for whatever reason, it just doesn't end up working out. With Snyder, in this piece, I think we are lucky in the sense that Tisha's been in DC. So Tisha Thompson's in DC. She's been reporting with you about a bunch of things that are going on a more immediate basis. And then I think that when the stadium stuff started to fall apart, when you could really see that, because look, we all thought this was going to be this crazy kind of like uniquely American thing where like Dan Snyder could be going from testifying in front of Congress to being wooed by the governor of Virginia or Maryland in a bidding war to see who would give them the most public money to build him a new stadium. And when that fell apart and he really had like no other options in terms of a stadium outside of just paying for it all himself somehow, that's to me when the flare lights went on, that this was really something, my repertorial antenna went up, that this was really something worth pursuing. Because as you know, that's the language that owners speak.
Right.
The hardest thing for owners to get a stadium built. So few of them are like Stan Kroenke, who can write a check for the land and write a check for the stadium and pay for any overages. It just doesn't work that way for most of these guys. And so that made it really interesting to me, because I knew that when the stadium essentially became a non-option in that region, I knew that his peers, his owners, the ones who ultimately will decide a bunch of this stuff with him, would be enraged by it and upset, because that's going to cost them money.
Right. And I'm going to get to that in a minute, because that's a major part of the story too. But then like when you're reporting it, and again, you're right, like I've been involved in stories at ESPN. We were last year trying to figure out some stuff. We'd have meetings after meetings to say, is there anything there? Is there anything there? And the answer sometimes like, well, we know this, but it's more hearsay and stuff that you wouldn't feel comfortable reporting.
Yeah.
So it never sees the light of day. Now, some of that is actually coming back into this story, because you see stuff. But so how many editors are going through it, and attorneys? I mean, there's a lot of layers to before it gets to the public domain.
Sure, there's a process, and it's a rigorous process, and it's very in depth. But like, we spend a lot of time here gathering information and then going back out to vet it and seeing how many people you have, because I've hung out with you at times or talked to you at times where you talk about things you hear or whatever, but you're not quite sure.
Right.
That's not how these stories work. I think that like what happens is you go out, you meet with people, you go out to dinner with an executive or an owner or whatever it might be. You try to get into an area where you can be comfortable and talk for a long time. So you can ask a lot of follow-ups and try to get a lot of information. Then you take all that information and see how much of it jives with talking to other people about it and what they've heard. And, Don Van Natta came in and any story he's involved in, he makes better. And we worked a lot together on the ownership world and the palace intrigue. And I think that we work well together for a host of reasons, but one of them is that we have different people.
Right.
And so that just helps so much in trying to like put a story like this together. And that and then eventually we kind of come to the point where you're trying to put together a story, and then it goes through drafts of that story. You have normal editorial feedback, you have fact checking, you have obviously like it's vetted many times. And then of course you have the moments when the team sort of wants to provide its perspective on whatever pieces of reporting that you bring to them. And, that's where you work in their stuff into the story and make sure that the word choices are precise and that, it feels fair. And so that's kind of how it all kind of comes together.
What surprised you most in the reporting of this from your end?
That's a great question. How aware everybody was that Snyder had told people that he had collected so much dirt, bragged about the dirt, and seemed defiant at a moment where he seemed weakened, and how unsurprised all the people were, from owners to league, whatever, that even Snyder had bragged about deploying private investigators. Just how, like, literally, I talked to one owner, and I asked if he had heard about that, and he said yes. And I asked what his reaction was when he heard about it, and he goes, "I wasn't surprised." And again, that's something that Snyder denied through the team spokesman. The law firm denied having any awareness of it. And maybe he hasn't, and that's something that we get at in the story. And maybe these are just scare tactics or a bluff. But I think that was the most interesting thing, is just, I think that if you had brought almost any other name with that kind of piece of reporting, where you're saying, "Hey, have you heard, I'm just making this up, that George McCaskey is following owners with private investigators," I mean, people would be completely shocked. And with Dan Snyder, it was not only like, "Yeah, we're all aware of that," and "No, we're not shocked at all."
Yeah, and so you talk to owners. You have always had good ends with the owners. Where have you? What is your outlook on what this means for Snyder from maybe 6 to 8 months ago? What they might do compared to where it is now? How much has it changed, if it has?
Like, they're angry. And what we reported in our story about him losing Jerry Jones, and about how Jerry Jones has told Dan personally that he might not be able to protect him, that stuff's accurate. And I don't know who's the most powerful owner. We had a line in the story where there was an executive joking that it was Dan Snyder who is the most powerful owner, because the owners don't want to do anything, take any action on him. But Jerry is definitely one of the most influential ones, and he tends to get his way when he wants something. And I think that this story isn't the reason why they might act on Dan. I would never think that. But I do think that it's another thing that they're frustrated about that's out in the open. And I do think that this can't go on forever as it is. We reported the story that Snyder's kind of game plan is to run out the clock and bet that Congress changes hands, and that the Mary Jo Wright report, takes so long to put together that nobody ends up really caring, or whatever it might be. He's moved on. He might be right. I don't know. But I think that you'll be able to get 24 owners who will say that right now, things as they're going, it's not sustainable, and it's not something that we want. And I don't know what the action will be, but I do think that it'll come to some sort of resolution and an action.
So the owners are meeting this coming week or next week.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Does it come up there? What do you think what do you think happens there? Do you
That's
know?
a weird, you would think so, but even in the privileged sessions, so that's all the executives are kicked out for those sessions. That is just owners. Or if they delegate an executives, it can be the executive, whatever. I think that, like, Seattle used to do that all the time. Paul Allen would never show up for meetings, so he would send his executive in his place. But they don't bring up Dan. And one of the owners told us, like, Roger doesn't look like he wants to touch this thing. They don't bring up Snyder in those sessions. And I reported on it a year ago, where Tanya Snyder apologized to the owners in the privilege session. She read it off of her phone, which was annoying to people who felt like it was a little insincere. But in that privilege session, her apology came up. The Gruden emails and Mark Davis came up. And then Jeff Pash came up, or Jeff Pash, the league's general counsel, got in front of the owners, and he said, Stan Kroenke is not inclined to pay the settlement with the city of St. Louis for $790 million, and we're going to have to figure out a way to divide that. And he, maybe he'll sue, who knows. And that was by far the thing that they focused on the most, not Snyder. And so even in subsequent meetings, he just has not come up in those sessions. And we asked why. A lot of people say, well, it's because Tanya is always there. So how can you have this frank conversation about the team if she's always there? Other people say, hey, she wasn't at the meetings in Atlanta in May, and it felt weird to like have the discussion without her there and unable to defend the team. All of it just reeks of people who don't want to have that sort of confrontational type of meeting.
So again, like over the last, when all this stuff first broke from the Washington Post stories a couple of years ago, when it first broke, kept hearing bad precedent, wouldn't want to vote him out because of that. And even up until, again, 6 to 8 months ago, that was the thought. Do you think that it's hard to say a number, but do you think a lot have moved on from that precedent and just are ready for it to be done?
Yes, I do. But I don't know how. And I think that like, it's the, and what, that's
right.
That's the thing. I think that if they could figure out a way for Snyder to move on without a fight, they would love that. I don't think that he's inclined to do that though.
Yeah,
and
that's
so they're
tough to
not
see.
exactly sure, how to handle this. But I do think that one of the interesting things about owners and ownership circles is that we think about them as all these kind of CEOs and head of their own enterprises. And that's true, they are. But when they're in that groupthink tends to prevail. Like there's very few votes that are like, 17 on one side and 15 on the other that are really close. That stuff doesn't happen that much. They all tend to vote in the same direction. And they like to be slow about things. Like the NFL owners are kind of about the status quo, and they like to be methodical, except when there's a big profit to immediately be made. Then they move really quickly. But they tend to be slow. And so I think that like whatever it is, when this does finally come to a head, and I do think that it will, I don't think that anybody thinks this can go on. I think that the vast majority of owners will be happy with the result so that they can cast their vote and feel okay about it. I think that like if they were just to like call a vote questioning Snyder's ownership on Tuesday, for instance, if they didn't get 24 voters, which is the requisite that they would need, Dan would find out everybody who voted for him. Right. So I just think that like they want to be very as careful as they possibly can about however this happens, whenever it happens.
And there are a couple ways that, for people who want him out, there are a couple ways that you guys laid out in the story very well. I know Tisha played a big role in that part too. But the debt waiver limit, and the transfer of power. Can you kind of explain both those and how that would work?
Well, the debt limit thing is interesting, and it relates to the stadium, in which Tisha Thompson did, some fantastic reporting, just showing exactly how that fell apart. As we said earlier, most owners can't afford to buy the stadium. So they're reliant on loans. And often they get loans from big banks and even from the league office. There's the G4 program, which loans owners who are building a stadium $200 million. But the league also has strict requirements on how much debt a team can carry, an owner can carry. And so what happens in all these stadium situations is they get these debt limit waivers. And Dan Snyder got one a year ago. He got a debt limit waiver for $450 million so that he could buy out his limited partners. These are almost always rubber stamp types of moves. They don't, have long debate sessions about these things. They almost always approve them. But there have been owners, especially on the finance committee, who've discussed not allowing Dan Snyder to borrow more money to build a stadium. They know that he's essentially cornered in DC, and they know that if he were to try to build a stadium, even under good circumstances, he would probably need a debt limit waiver. And they've talked about not permitting that as a way to kind of force his hand, and maybe so that he would like transfer to Tanya, who, look, they would love to just have like a clean sale, get $6 billion, whatever it is, for that team, and start new with that fan base. But the idea of a permanent transfer to Tanya is something that isn't perfect, but something that people would be willing to deal with because I think she's enjoyed being representing the team in those sessions. I think that she enjoys kind of being the face of the team at those sessions. People respect her, even if like they got on, she got on their nerves when she read the apology off of her phone. But I think they look at that as a much more appealing resolution than, Dan being there in the event that his goal is to transfer the team to his children.
But even in that case, I mean, if it's still in the family, how does that really cut him out?
Great question. And it's something that we wrote about, in the story, where if he's around, can that ever change? Can the team ever change? We had that section about, is Jason Wright really empowered to be able to create the change that he wants in the face of all of these executives leaving all the time? And of course, there's Dan. Can he help himself? How do you even govern that? Those are great questions, and I don't know if anybody has great answers for them at the moment.
And then the other thing is that you brought up Stan Kroenke, and that's coming to a head as well. Again, how much will that continue to overshadow all of this, do you think?
Well, yeah. So for the listeners to try to understand that, I mean, that's something that I wrote about a year ago at the league meetings, where the city of St. Louis sued the NFL, saying that they had violated contracts that they'd essentially signed with the city when they allowed the team to move, and violated its own relocation policy. And that lawsuit did not go away. Usually whenever a team moves, a lawsuit kind of flares up and then it fizzles, but this did not go away. And they ended up reaching a settlement agreement for $790 million. And I think every owner thought that Stan Kroenke was going to pay that, because the morning in January of 2016 in Houston, I think it was the Intercontinental Hotel, but I might be mistaken. But that morning, when they were going to vote on LA, every owner involved had to sign an indemnification agreement agreeing to absolve their fellow owners of any litigation that would come up from this. And Kroenke signed it. Apparently, it was a very poorly worded one. And so Kroenke believes that he did nothing wrong and he shouldn't have to pay this entire amount. And everybody else messed it up, and he's not going to be on the hook for it. There hasn't been an easy resolution to that. Owners do not like writing big checks for things, especially when they're used to receiving those big checks. And we will see what happens. I mean, they're supposed to vote on a resolution for it this week, and I don't know how it's going to go, but we'll see.
How could that influence? Because you said like they may have to write a big check. Then you look over here and you say, hey, we could be getting more checks if you did a better job over here. Could that have some sort of trickle-down impact on the Snyder situation?
I don't think so, because the Snyder situation is just so different. Whereas like when these owners voted to allow the Chargers, the Raiders, the Rams to leave, they get what's called a relocation fee. I think that it was $550 million that the owner who moves has to pay the fellow owner. So divide that by 31, whatever it is, they net out. So that's a good amount of money that they got just for a vote. It's a pretty good return, right? Whereas like the money that they would get from a new stadium in DC, I think would help the overall pie. But I don't think it's quite as simple as, hey, we got this check because these teams moved, and now because of this lawsuit and this settlement, we have to write a check out. I don't think it's quite apples to apples.
Why is Roger so afraid of Dan, do you think? It seems like that.
He just does not seem eager to confront this. And I think that he inherently is more comfortable handling integrity of the game type of issues as he has over the years. You know, with the Patriots, I mean, Robert Kraft, one of his closest confidants and key allies, he's fined them first-round picks 3 times during their dynasty run, 3 times for rules violations. And yet, when it comes to other things that Robert Kraft has gotten in trouble for off the field, the league just doesn't really want to move. And as much as they talk about owners being held to the highest standard, it is just different. And The other thing is that he works for the Snyders.
Right.
And, I don't think that nobody I talked to said that Roger Goodell is out there trying to whip votes. And it would be inappropriate, I think, if he did. I think that like he takes the temperature of people and he knows the pulse of what's going on, but he's been so clear that this is an owner-driven decision. Even if, as we report in the story, he wants Dan gone and he wants all of this off his plate.
Did you talk to any owners who really have a firm support for Dan?
No.
There you go. If you had to, like, this is hard to do, and I
have talked to people who see varying degrees of what should be consequences for all of these various scandals. I've talked to people who, for instance, you bring up this, we talk about this ticket thing that came up with the former employee in Congress, and is he taking money that should be going to his owners? I haven't seen anyone in the ownership circles who's that upset about that, and actually is convinced that he might be doing it. There's a lot of checks and balances in place within the league office that was actually set up by Brian LaFemina, who ended up leaving the league to work for Dan Snyder before he was fired 6 months later. But to set up checks and balances so that teams are accountable in terms of paying into the pot. And sometimes teams don't have accurate accounting and they end up owing in. Right. But I don't think anybody looks at it like something nefarious. And I even talk to owners who really don't see that as being that big of a deal. I think at the end of the day, the things that are the big deal is the accumulation of negative headlines, the fact that a cherished fan base and valued market is so dispirited with the state of the team and the state of the owner, and the fact that the salvation was going to be his ability to get that stadium. And at this point, nobody knows how there's a path forward on that. I think those are all the things.
Then the last thing too is, when you guys talk to people, everybody's got some level, not about an agenda, but a reason why they want to talk now. A lot of people were talking now. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, people bring that up sometimes where they say, hey, this was like a coordinated thing, and they use Seth, Don, and Tisha to get it out. And
you guys talk to too many people for that to be the case.
I wish that were the case.
That's definitely not the case.
I think that people react to information. Like, first of all, Don and I, Tisha to a lesser extent, because we haven't worked with her on these stories, but Don and I have been swimming in these waters for a long time. We've been doing a lot of these owner stories for a long time. So when we bring something to someone, I think that they know that we have serious business to discuss.
Right.
And then I think they react to information like, hey, we've heard this. We heard that such and so this person said this in that meeting. Is that what you heard? Why do you think they said that? Blah, 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 but whatever it might be. That's what people react to, much more than like, hey, they're trying to get, an agenda across or whatever, because there was not a single person out of the 30-some people that we talked to who raised their hand and said, hey, if you're ever doing a Dan Snyder story over the years, please call me. It never happened.
No, and I apologize. I do have one more, and I'm not asking for a guess as to the outcome, but where do you think this goes? Based on your analysis, talking to people, where do you think this goes for Dan over the next year, couple years?
I just cannot see a situation where he's allowed to be a face of the team or a primary decision maker in any way. And I don't know how they get to there. I really don't. I don't think they know. I don't see how it could happen. I think that the Mary Jo White report will come out and they will react off of that. But I do think that whatever they react off of, I think it's like the thing that they need to say, justification to cast their vote.
Seth, I appreciate your time. Great stuff. Great job on the reporting. And that's why I want to let people know some of the process. So it's not just some, hey, we heard this, let's put it out there. It's all that goes into it. And there's so much stuff. As long as that story was, trust me, it could have been 3 times the size based on what you guys have. But you can't vet everything. So there you go. I appreciate you joining me. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, man. It's a good feeling when you're cutting good stuff. Where good stuff
Right.
isn't being thrown in the story. But I appreciate it. It's always good to talk to you, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.